So thank you, Dave. Hi, everyone. So today I am going to be talking about high-tempo testing. And for a lot of you, it's actually going to be irrelevant at this point. But eventually, you're going to hit a point where you're having trouble scaling growth. You hit a wall with growth. It happened to us on growthhackers.com. And at that point, high-tempo testing is going to matter a lot. But in the meantime, it's all about hustle. And our hustle as a company started the day that I sent out this tweet, which was a little over a year and a half ago. And from that moment, we were in total hustle mode, just basically trying to get to the point where we could build a viable community, get people coming into that community on a daily basis and interacting. And when your product is a community, you have no product day one. You have to create the product on the fly, and it was a big challenge. And so just as Josh talked about, we looked to an external platform to help us do that, and that platform for us was Twitter. The main reason we focused on Twitter was that that's what the research showed us we should be focused on. So we talked to people who were passionate about growth, so marketers, engineers that were into growth, and most of them said they were finding inspiring content about growth on Twitter. So one of the benefits of Twitter is that it's easy to identify the people who are passionate about the subject that you want to connect with them about. And with a product like unfollowers.com, you can actually just search phrases and find people who are tweeting about that topic and then follow those people. And as long as you have good content in your feed that is something that they're going to be interested in, there's a good chance they'll follow you back. So one of the advantages that we had with growthhackers.com was that our feed was essentially curated and created by the people who are on the site. So people come there and submit content in much the way that Hacker News or Reddit that they do, and then they vote up the best content, and that was a big advantage for us, was being able to have a long tail of this content that we could then feed into our Twitter stream, and we were able to get our followers up to the thousands and then the tens of thousands and now over 100,000 just by repeating this process on a daily basis. And our goal was to bring lots of people to the site, and when they got to the site, to engage with them and host conversations around that content. And it was a nonstop crazy hustle time that we literally, when I went to bed at night, it seemed that that's when all the spammers would come out and would start putting totally irrelevant content on the site. And then, so first thing in the morning, you got to wake up and check it, and you sleep for a few hours, and you want to wake up and check it. And then, Saturdays and Sundays, we couldn't take off because we didn't want people coming in and interacting, and then we weren't there to keep the conversation going. So it was literally every day, every hour of every day, we had to keep checking in. And we had vacations, but they looked a bit like this. But most of the time, we were buried in a computer and just trying to keep that conversation going. And it took about 3 months. You can see that dip was over the Christmas holidays. And the challenge is when people want to check out with their families, all the work that we had done to get to that point, we just didn't want to have to start over in January. So I was actually in Hawaii over that first Christmas holiday and was very busy in a lounge chair with a laptop, just staying engaged in the community. But after about 3 months, we reached some level of stability and viability, which was really what the first objective was just to make the community viable. And then we started thinking about growth goals and how do we manage growth kind of month after month and set I think initially we were setting a 20% month over month growth target on monthly active users, and then after a while it got a little choppy, so we took it down to 10% and then back up to 20%, but we were really managing the output. And fits and starts, we got to 90,000 monthly active users at about the 1 year mark. And then we hit the wall that I mentioned earlier. And for 3 straight months, we stayed at 90,000 monthly active users. And the challenge was that I was so focused on the goal that we just didn't have as much focus on actually how we were going to achieve the goal. And part of it was we weren't managing the outputs. I was very specific about the input, or about the output, but we weren't managing the inputs. And the inputs are what you actually control. And that was something that I'd heard from Andrew Chin. And that's when the light bulb went off for me, that we need to be more specific about the input side. So I had been saying, I've always said testing is how you figure out how to grow a business. And I kept telling the team, test more, but we were all busy. I was busy. We also had Qualaroo as a business, so about half my time was spent on Qualaroo, but we had some dedicated people who were building product, managing the Twitter feed, getting images into the Twitter feed, interacting with people on Twitter, and then all of us engaging in the community. There just wasn't a lot of time left for testing. And so I figured that we're not gonna be doing testing if we didn't actually set a specific goal around it. So I said, all right, we're going to find a way to do 3 tests per week, launch 3 tests per week. And I called it our high tempo testing initiative. But just by being really clear that 3 tests per week, they'll be the best 3 tests we can come up with, but 3 tests per week is what we need to focus on. And I'm pretty confident that that'll start to get us out of the growth challenges. And here's what happened. Basically, from the minute that we started this 3 tests per week, we fell into the most consistent growth period from the start of the site. And today, the number is, I believe, 170,000. So it was just in January that we were stuck at 90,000. Now we're at 170,000 monthly active users. Same size team, no marketing spend. It was just the testing was the big difference. And what we had done is that we'd moved from this hustle phase, which is really critical. Paul Graham talks about do things that don't scale. It's really hustle. Hustle is what gets you on the map. You got to do that in the beginning. But we'd moved to this growth process that started to look a lot more like how Facebook's growth team manages growth, how LinkedIn's growth team manages growth. Even last year, Brian Balfour presented on the growth process that he uses with HubSpot and the Sidekick product that they have. And so a lot of companies have this predictable growth process, and startups tend to be a little allergic to process, and for good reason. You're still getting a feel for things, but eventually a process is what gets you some consistency and reliability in reaching growth curves. So our growth process looked like this. Unbridled ideation. We need to generate a lot of ideas. We need an effective way to prioritize those ideas, and then high tempo testing, so we need to implement and run those ideas, and then we need to organize the results in a knowledge base. And that knowledge base tends to spark more ideas, and the process repeats itself week after week with that target of launching 3 tests per week. And but there's a lot of challenges with this. It's not something that you just sort of set the goal and start doing it. So these are the challenges that we've come up against in the last few months as we're trying to execute at this high tempo. The first is enough ideas. Now, a lot of people say, oh, we have lots of ideas. That's not going to be a problem for us. But probably the reason you have lots of ideas is because you have challenge number 3 on there, which is the implementing the ideas thing. So if you're not implementing them, it feels like you have a lot of ideas. The minute that you start implementing the ideas, you need to keep digging deeper to come up with more ideas, and that can be really challenging. Assuming you get a lot of ideas, then it's about prioritizing those ideas, and that can be a challenge. So what tests do I actually run each week? What are the set of tests that we're running each week? And I'll talk about how we've overcome each of these challenges in a minute. Implementing tests, I've already touched on that one. Accurate testing, so how do you instrument the tests in a way that you're actually getting an accurate result back? How do you analyze them so that you know that you're not just wasting your time doing the tests, but you're actually learning as you're doing them and acting on them in the right way? And then once you've run hundreds of tests, how do you prevent yourself from just running the same tests over and over again? And so you need a good way to organize those tests to prevent that. So let's tackle the first objective, or the first challenge, which was generating enough ideas. And so, in a big company, maybe you can have a big growth team that's going to help you come up with the ideas. But in our case, we wanted to not just invite our full team into the idea process, but we invited members of our community, interns, advisors, friends. We've got 20 plus people who've contributed ideas to our backlog, which is now over 300 ideas that we now want to go through and test. And then you want to make sure that you group those ideas or that you're focused on really all of the growth levers, not just the ones that traditionally fall into marketing, which tends to be in the acquisition area, but taking Dave's R framework and looking at things like acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. An improvement in any one of those areas is going to improve your growth rate, so you want to have lots of ideas around each of those areas. And then finally, celebrating the people who come up with ideas. So each week, I take the ideas from the week and who came up with the most ideas and send it out to the full team on Slack and say, hey, great job, Anuj, this week on being our idea leader. We publish our top idea contributors overall. And the more that we celebrate the ideas, the more people want to participate. And it's really important because what you find is that people on the support team are going to come up with very different ideas than engineers are going to come up with. And what I found is big wins from the ideas in both groups, that engineers tend to come up with ideas around what's possible, and those are going to often be big breakthrough ideas, where support, it's going to be a lot more around empathy. They're talking to customers every day, and they're going to know some good ways to improve the experience for customers and good new ways to reach out to customers. So generating enough ideas really starts with unbridled ideation, no judgment, just anything goes, just collect the ideas, get them in raw format, but then you have to start to be able to narrow them down to something that you can actually act on. And that's where the prioritizing idea challenge starts to get addressed, which is when you formalize ideas in an experiment doc, and that's what most of the big growth teams out there are using, a pretty detailed experiment doc to organize their ideas. So they're looking at things like, what kind of research do we have that suggests that this is going to be an effective idea? What's the hypothesis? What do we actually think this idea is going to do? Do we think it's going to increase this metric or that metric? But being very specific about what is the goal of the idea, and then trying to group them around levers so that you know that this is an idea that's going to be important for retention. And specifically in retention, we think it's going to drive more frequent visits or whatever it might be. And then finally, I like to score ideas. There's a lot of different ways you can score them. Some people use a pie kind of scoring method. I like to score on something that we call the ICE score, which is impact. So we're on a scale of 1 to 10, we're looking at if this thing works, how impactful can it be? And it's a bit of a gut check, and you're just, I think, and what we start to see is that I have one guy that every idea he ever comes up with is a 10, and another guy, his ideas are always 4s, and it tends to be that the guy with the 4 ideas has more winners. So, you start to be able to normalize on that a little bit over time. How confident are you? This is where some of the research comes in. Do you have some research that suggests that this idea is actually meaningful and is likely going to work? And then ease. Is it easy to test this idea? So once we've scored them on these things, it becomes a lot easier to compare ideas, to narrow down into, all right, what are the easiest retention ideas that we want to run? And so when I said we're targeting 3 ideas per week, we actually tee up 5 ideas per week with the assumption that we're going to maybe miss on a couple of them. Last week we got all 5. Other weeks it's only 3. But a lot of times the last couple of ideas that we're adding are a couple of really easy ideas that fall within an area that's important to us. So assuming that you can prioritize which ideas you want to implement, this is where a lot of people get caught up, which is actually in the implementation of the ideas. And this was probably one of the biggest challenges that we faced, was just carving out the resources to implement the ideas and making sure that week to week that we implemented them. So what I found to be super effective for this is our weekly growth meeting. So we hold it Tuesday mornings, and we sit down and we say, all right, which ideas did we tee up for last week? Who was responsible for implementing each of those ideas, and were we actually able to implement those ideas? And if not, why not? So we start to really understand them, and then we're also laying out what are the ideas for this week. And so again, as we sort into the areas of, all right, we're really focused on retention right now, let's get some good ideas in retention. So as a team, we get this done in about an hour, and we're able to have good accountability for what we agreed to do last week, and set up the tests for this week. I think what tends to work best for most teams is to actually have an autonomous team that's responsible for implementing the ideas. So we've come up against this a few times where one of the main reasons that ideas don't get implemented for us is that the person who was responsible for doing it got caught up in fighting a bug or in a big feature release, and without an autonomous team, it's just too easy to get pulled off, and you just say, oh, we'll do it next week. We'll make up for it next week. You never make up for it. You gotta get it done this week, and if you don't, you gotta understand why and try to re-instrument the business so that you can. And then finally, some tools like MailChimp or Optimizely or even some of the HubSpot product allows less technical people to set up and run tests, and you're able to get more done when more people are capable of implementing them. So once you've got them implemented, accurate testing, this gets a lot of us. Fortunately, Pep is the next speaker, and his entire presentation is around how to do accurate testing. So I'm not going to try to cover that subject. We'll let Pep, who's the guy who I always turn to for that anyway. He's written a bunch of great stuff on it, and he's going to speak on it in a minute. And then finally, avoiding repeats is a big challenge. And the best way to overcome that challenge is to make sure that every test you're running is being captured in a knowledge base and is being organized around, did it work? Did it not work? Was it inconclusive? Tagging the tests. So is it a Twitter test? Is it something on the site? Is it email? The more that you can make all of the tests accessible, and that you're clear about it, and that you're sharing those results with everybody across the company, you want to be as transparent as you can across the entire testing process. If you want to encourage the extended team to submit ideas, they're going to need to know what happens with ideas. And so the knowledge base becomes really important for how you organize that and share that with the team. Assuming you do all of those things, then it really comes down to high tempo testing is first and foremost about the process. And, but assuming that you've got the process down, then it becomes about how do I get people in the right place on that process to execute, to analyze, to implement, to come up with the ideas, and then how do I manage that all within a system? But really, each of these things are dependent on the process itself. You need to have a process down. This process has been really effective for us. And the benefit of this process is that it kicks out tests like this. And this is an example of a test that my guy who rates all of his testing ideas as a 4, this was one of his 4 tests. And it was simply moving an email from the bottom of the page, an email collector from the bottom of the page to the top of the page, and took less than an hour to implement that test using something like Optimizely, but that single test resulted in a 700% increase in emails collected, and there's a lot of times that a test like this would get bumped for things that were a 10, but since we gave ourselves that target of 3 tests per week, it forced us to do some easier ones like this. And a lot of times the tests that take a week or 2 to implement actually don't yield a result, and the ones that you don't think are going to be highly impactful but are pretty easy to implement do generate a result. And the only way you're going to know is to test a lot of things. And so holding yourself to a test target tends to help you identify what's going to work and what's not going to work. So the big advantages of this whole process are that you move from this hustle, just trying to grab traction and doing things in a bit of a haphazard way, which is okay. That's important in the beginning, but eventually you need predictable growth, and this process lends itself to much more predictable growth. It's also a lot more scalable. One of the biggest benefits that I didn't anticipate is that the hiring becomes a lot easier, because now instead of going out and looking for the unicorn hire to help me get retention, who's going to come up with all the ideas and be really process-driven and get everything implemented and highly analytical. Now I'm really looking at it more as an assembly line for growth, and I start to say, we've got 300 ideas in the backlog. We don't necessarily need that creativity right now. What we need is more people to implement ideas. So, all right, I need to hire 1 more engineer dedicated to growth, or we've implemented a lot, but the analysis is weak, or we have a big backlog of analysis. I want to start plugging in more people to analyze tests, and that's our most recent hire, was someone to help us with the queue of analysis and manage the knowledge base for us. So each of these are the benefits that you get from this process, is that the bottlenecks that you start to identify help with the hiring. You get much more predictable growth, and ultimately that's what it's all about, is figuring out a way to drive growth in a predictable, repeatable way. So good news is that we have 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, we can dive into that. Otherwise, we can try to get back on schedule. Yep, got one there. Thank you.
Content distribution, spamming, direct marketing, those kind of applications and solutions. All right, I'll start over. It seems like most of the applications you're talking about are content distribution, spamming, direct marketing, that kind of stuff. Do you have words of advice or insights into consumer productivity, things that are more doing things rather than content?
Okay, so his question, to try to repeat it, was it seems like most of the things that we're doing are around content distribution and spamming, and do we have some things that are more, what was the last piece, user-friendly?
Consumer productivity.
Consumer productivity.
Other than content.
Okay, so in our case, our website is built around content. So I'm using an example. Most of the examples that I'm doing are about, we have a community that's built around discussions with content. And so for us, it's about getting content in front of people, bringing them in, and having a conversation around that content, and trying to have good content. I'm a big fan of spam, so I wouldn't want to take that away. No, I'm not a big fan of spam. So to me, relevant content and being able to make sure that we have the right content in front of the right person. So all emails that we send out, for example, are opt-in emails. So in my mind, it is around the reason that people come to us is that they're looking for ideas of effective tests to run. They're trying to understand platforms better, to tap into those platforms. So our content is a means to their efficiency in what it is that they're trying to do. Your product and a lot of other products are going to be pretty different. So like when I worked with Dropbox, a lot of the tests that we were running were around trying to understand what was their initial intent when they signed up for the product. Was it to make their data accessible across multiple devices? Was it to set up a shared environment with someone else where they can collaborate on a set of documents? And depending on what their objectives were, most of our tests were around better delivering on those objectives and thinking about how do we sequence information in a way that they originally achieve their objective, but then start to get a broader understanding of other things that they can do with the product, and knowing that once they had done these 3 things with the product, that the likelihood they considered a must-have would go up substantially. So I think in all cases, in the case of Dropbox, we also then incented people to share the experience. So that would be on the acquisition side. But for a lot of the people, a lot of the sharing that they were rewarded for was just the normal daily use of sharing. So they were inviting people into a shared folder who would then sign up. Even if they hadn't opted into to the program, they would get more additional space. So that worked well. We didn't need to spend lots of money in growing that business. Hopefully that answers your question, but I really think it's dependent on the business itself, and it's all about, whatever you're doing should be about experiments to get more people to get the key benefit of the product, and your growth that you should really be celebrating should be around units of utility that you're delivering to your target people, and that's going to be different for every type of product. So we got time for one more question. Yep.
Do you use any management tool to manage this process of high-tempo testing?
Okay, so he was asking if we use a management tool to manage the process of high-tempo testing. In our case, we built a tool. We didn't have a good tool out there to do that. We've been building a tool for a while for internal use and making it available to a few outside companies that's in private beta right now. So thanks for asking that question.
What's the name of the tool?
You can sign up for the private beta at canvas.growthhackers.com. So I think that's it. We're done. All right, thank you, everybody.